Hey, so I thought I'd wrap up my series on the soul. Um, just to be clear, anything which I make a little series on, I can always add to it later. It's just sort of to keep myself moving from topic to topic. In any case, I thought I'd wrap up the series with the idea which sort of is the unifying thread for all of the other videos in this little series on the afterlife, which would be the soul. The supernatural thing which unifies not only all of these videos, but also ourselves with the supernatural. Um, Generally, it's sort of the bridge, I would say, between the physical and the supernatural realms of heaven, hell, purgatory, the divine, what have you. It's an interesting thing to try to suss out whether the soul is it the sort of supernatural believer's conception of the self or of the mind, or is it both? Um, and then there's also the question of how does it exist in conjunction with the physical body. Is like, where is the soul? Is it just, I mean, where is the soul seems like a ridiculous question, but for the soul and the physical body to be as one, there must be some sort of interaction happening between them. Obviously, to sort of say it from the outset, although you can probably already guess, I don't believe that the soul exists. Just like I don't believe in a whole bunch of the other things that I've talked about here on this channel so far. But it's just interesting. I feel like the question of where is the soul in relation to the physical body, I feel like that's still a valid question, because say that you have the hypothesis that they exist together, but somehow the soul can operate in on this other like dimension which we can't perceive, and yet the soul and the body must interact with not only the same things but with each other in some sort of way. They have to be connected somehow, which is why the question arises, where is it? Why can't we seem to find it? Um, Now, I feel like those are valid questions. In any case, however, um, there is sort of this idea that the soul is sort of the solution to the mind. There is, after all, the mind body problem in philosophy, as well as identity, which the soul also potentially addresses, even though, just like other supernatural claims, it lacks the evidence to sort of substantiate it and holster it up as the true explanation. The soul sort of catches all of these sort of disparate ideas that philosophy has been trying to suss out for decades, centuries. The issues with regard to how to understand the self, identity, the mind, all of these things are encapsulated within the idea of the soul, because it could just be thought of as a composite entity of all of these things, or have featuring all of these characteristics within itself as just part of it, existing in this different metaphysical substrate, or whatever you want to call it. And then there's also, with that, coupled with that, is the idea that the soul will itself, according to your beliefs, embark on a number of different journeys, whether it be, you know, going to heaven, going to hell, reincarnation, uniting with the universal soul, anyone, or becoming a ghost. Almost forgot about ghosts. I guess because it's slightly outside of the other three. The other three are sort of destinations and points of reference, whereas with ghosts you're sort of just trapped on Earth and it's sort of a limbo sort of a state. I also didn't really get into how belief in ghosts ties it back into sort of maybe Christian or other Abrahamic beliefs, and whether you're stuck on Earth as a ghost and eventually go to heaven, eventually go to hell. How does that work? Do those beliefs sort of overlap in any way? In any case, this soul, this entity, the supernatural entity which exists alongside the physical body, embarks on some sort of, ultimate journey. It sort of goes with the entire narrative that I believe I believe exists within all religious ideas, really, that we are sort of these protagonists in this cosmic epic story. I don't know. At some level, I feel like theism has this sort of grain within it of, it is very self-focused. Like, sure, there are the teachings of be good to others, but when the ultimate goal is, living in paradise forever in the afterlife, there is a sense of sort of self-interest to it, which I'm not going to knock. I mean, you can't get away from it, but it is a little interesting because these religions tend to tout themselves as being selfless in every way, above reproach, but there is quite a bit of self-interest to it. And I mean, something else I didn't really mention in my other videos on heaven and hell is that not only do you have the carrot at the end of the road with regards to heaven, you also have the stick of hell. So you have both punishment and reward. And same thing in Hinduism, punishment and reward in terms of where you go in your reincarnation cycles. Buddhism sort of carries the same thing. Punishment in terms of reincarnating further down in this sort of hierarchical ladder of, being, and then, ascending to nirvana. The soul goes on all sorts of different and incredible journeys according to whatever belief you may happen to have. It's just that, just like the other ideas that I've talked about, although ghosts may be a little bit outside of this, but they all sort of have the same issue of, like, without the demonstration that the self can exist outside of the body and how it can do that, when we've never really had a objectively verifiable case or any sort of evidence to show that this can happen, then it calls into question ghosts. So I guess it still does fit in. It calls into question the idea of heaven, the idea of hell, reincarnation, all of it. Which is why I kept mentioning throughout the videos that, the questions about the soul are integral to understanding questions about all of these different ideas of the afterlife, because the soul is integral to all of them. It's sort of a universal idea, the idea of the soul, of a non-physical self that continues after the physical self no longer functions or ceases to be, that something which can be believed to be you, continues on in some sort of way. Which, to go back to my series on conceiving of the divine, I feel like, and also to go back to my video about heaven, and in some way also my reincarnation video, there's a running theme of, you want to be comforted by your beliefs. And I believe that's a very big drive in all of these beliefs, that you're looking for some sort of comfort, but, there's some sort of reward or something to give you some sort of incentive to do better. So you have something positive waiting for you at the end. But I guess to also give you that extra push to have a a potential punishment that you might have to deal with along the way as well. It's just that in the case of Christians, the potential punishment is sort of like, at least with reincarnation, you can sort of go up and down and, find your way back to peace and nirvana and everlasting happiness eventually. But with the Christian worldview, or any worldview that shares this sort of idea, you could potentially find yourself never able to get back to any sort of peace and be stuck in eternal torment, which is an interesting sort of caveat of the idea of the afterlife in Abrahamic religions. There's there's the potential that you could completely fail to ever reach, heaven and peace and paradise and happiness, and just get stuck forever in the bad place, the place you don't want to be in, the last place you'd ever want to be in. But yeah, and so I feel like, just in the same way as a god, there really hasn't been any evidence to demonstrate that the soul is a thing which exists. And in the case of the soul, it's even harder to use some sort of deistic counter argument or sort of workaround, because with the soul, like I was mentioning earlier, it necessarily has to interact in some sort of way with the physical world, which puts it in the right place for us to be able to verify it, demonstrate it, provide evidence for it, and yet we have never been able to do so. We've had, ideas of near-death experiences, or people seeing the light when they die for a brief period of time before they're resuscitated and can tell people about what they saw. But none of these actually point to a soul per se, because they don't rule out the idea that it could be, because of the mind or the brain, which is malfunctioning at the time of death, or in the process of dying. So, and it's the case in a lot of supernatural claims, whether it be God or the afterlife, the divine, the supernatural, all of this. It tends to be the case where the claims or the proposed evidences do not necessarily rule out a alternative explanation, which in many cases turns out to be the more reasonable or a believable explanation, because it can be supported by evidence, because it comports to what we observe in reality already. And so, yeah, theistic and supernatural claims really suffer because of that, in terms of being recognized, by a person who's skeptic like me. Like, sure, I mean, a lot of people are still convinced by those, are still convinced of those claims, and are not really affected by what I'm saying right now about it lacking evidence. But, if you want to know why your beliefs are not being accepted by a skeptic or an atheist like myself, it's a good reason as to why. Or one of the good reasons as to why. Just that you haven't necessarily provided evidence for these claims in a way where you can't rule out some other explanation which is much more accessible and, apparent, given the observations we have already made of the natural world. And for the soul, that applies very much so. I don't believe, it's funny, the whole thing about having a soul, because I often see the question come up of, do you believe that pets have souls like people do, or some variation of that? And it's funny because I don't believe neither myself nor like your pet dog have souls. Neither of us do, because I don't believe that souls are a thing. For the reasons which I pretty much just laid out a little earlier. But it's just funny, it's not funny, but it's very fascinating, because even though I don't really believe it to be a thing, for a lot of people, it is important for both age-old religions, but also New Age beliefs. The soul is really important to people who believe in, let's say, the chakra or, Kabbalistic beliefs, which I believe I'm going to sort of lump in with New Age because we have a lot of people that nowadays who believe in these Kabbalistic ideas, which are oftentimes sort of heavily influenced by Hindu belief and Buddhist belief, but I digress a little bit. But it's interesting that this thing, which we've never been able to really show truly exists, or truly been able to show exists, that it's really important to so many different beliefs. And I believe a big part of that is because of, or I would argue that a big part of that is because of the drive in human beings to want to live on or to preserve ourselves. And so the soul and any sort of afterlife that you believe that this version of yourself will eventually exist within. So whatever afterlife you believe that your soul will eventually reside in, your soul continues. You continue in some way, and that comforts people. As long as you end up in the desired place. But you do continue on, which I think is, in and of itself, outside of where the soul ends up, where you end up, it's still comforting that you don't cease to exist. Which, again, sort of exists in stark contrast to my own belief of, impermanence is it's just something you have to accept, because it is, as far as we can tell, the way of the world. Nothing lasts forever, not even the world itself. But for people who believe in an afterlife and in a soul, which necessarily or usually is coupled with the idea of the afterlife, for people who believe in those sort of things, it's not truly the end. Death isn't truly the end. It's really, to them, just a new beginning. Like, I know it sounds corny, but if you think about it, it's really true. You die, and then you begin your life, either your afterlife, either in hell for all of eternity, in heaven for all of eternity, or in the case of reincarnation, just eventually hoping that you can get to nirvana, or in Hinduism at least to a higher echelon of the societal hierarchy. So, yeah. And I think part of the appeal of the soul, the idea of the soul, in excluding these ideas of it being able to comfort people in the way that it allows you to live on in some sort of way after your death, it can also be something that you can fall back on when you're stuck trying to resolve issues with regard to, philosophical ideas of the self, of identity, of the mind, which are all huge questions, even to this day in philosophy, specifically when it comes to the ideas of identity and the mind-body problem. Those are, huge, still debated topics in philosophy, and the soul is a neat little. It's a very great sort of panacea to sort of answer it all, to sort of tie it up in a nice bow to be done with it. But just like in the case of God, who can also be seen as a panacea, it lacks a lot of explanatory power, and then it doesn't have evidence to substantiate it as a worthwhile explanation for the reasons I mentioned. So, but because an argument from ignorance can be quite appealing in the face of enormous questions, because it allows you to just get to an answer, it's still prevalent as a alternative explanation to these issues that arise from the mind, identity, personhood, all sorts of philosophical questions. And so it sticks around. Much like a lot of theistic or supernatural beliefs, they have these qualities about them or these attributes about them which make them appealing. It appeals not only to our desire to be comforted and to live on, but also to our desire to have an answer to the huge questions which we may have. And so, just like with God, with the being personal and powerful, it is an appealing idea, and for that reason, it continues on. It has staying power. Not in terms of like an actual explanation, but in terms of a belief that people hold. And so when you want to really think about why certain beliefs are so prevalent and so long lasting and so resistant to, you know, disappearing, to coming to any sort of end, it's because these religious and supernatural beliefs are very much they do have their appeal, a very strong appeal, which reflects upon our deepest human desires. The soul. I don't believe I have one, but it's still a fascinating idea, and one which it's an idea which permeates many religions, probably the majority of religions. It's probably an idea that which may be even more prevalent than the belief in God. Maybe, or maybe they exist at like the same level, but it's, I don't know, it's like overlooked a little bit in these debates between like atheists and theists. But the belief in the soul is a pervasive one in all kinds of cultures and religions. And I believe that it's not because the idea is necessarily supported by evidence, but because it is an attractive one. It is a potential explanation for so many questions we have, and comforting us when it comes to our dread, our fear of dying. Because as human beings, as living beings, we have the desire to live on. It's, it's one of our natural drives. And so the afterlife, the soul, which facilitates the afterlife and makes the afterlife possible, becomes all that more appealing. This sort of commentary on the soul this turned into, but this is going to be the wrap-up for the final video to wrap up my little series on the afterlife. And I believe this will be an interesting sort of segue into any other supernatural ideas that I might touch upon, because, it is sort of vague, but also connects to so many other different ideas. And so before this video gets too long, I'm going to stop it here. And I thank you to anyone who watched. Hope you had a happy new year and didn't get too drunk. I didn't, but that's just because I don't drink much. But I hope everyone's well. I hope anyone who watched this is well. I thank you, and, well, bye-bye.